Welcome to War Archives Black. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed and leave a like to stay inside the operation.
File 47. The Smile Doctrine: How Charm, Humor, and Cinema Became Tools of Obedience. There is a photograph that no longer exists in any official archive. It was taken in the spring of 1942, somewhere in the hills above Los Angeles, at a private gathering that was never recorded in any guest book or society column. The men in the photograph are smiling. Their suits are pressed, their ties perfectly knotted, their faces relaxed in the California sun. They look like businessmen celebrating a successful quarter, like producers toasting a hit film, like friends enjoying an afternoon away from the pressures of war. But these men were not friends, and what they were celebrating was not a film. What they were celebrating was the successful weaponization of joy itself. The photograph was destroyed in 1947, along with most of the documentation related to what came to be known internally as the Smile Doctrine. The operation had no official designation, no congressional oversight, no paper trail that could be followed by historians or journalists decades later. It existed in the space between government agencies and private industry, between propaganda and entertainment, between what people chose to believe and what they were made to believe. And it worked so perfectly that even now, 80 years later, most people have no idea it ever happened at all. This is the story of how an entire generation learned to love their chains because someone taught them how to smile while wearing them. This is the story of how freedom itself became a brand, how rebellion was turned into a product, and how the most effective form of control ever devised was disguised as the thing people wanted most: happiness. This is File 47. This is the Smile Doctrine. In the winter of 1940, a man named Edward Caldwell sat in a windowless office in Washington, D.C., reading reports that terrified him. Caldwell worked for a division of the Office of War Information that technically did not exist, a small group of psychologists, sociologists, and former advertising executives tasked with understanding how modern propaganda functioned and, more importantly, how it could be countered. The reports he was reading were intercepted intelligence documents from Germany, translated transcripts of internal Nazi Party communications about the effectiveness of their domestic information campaigns. What disturbed Caldwell was not the content of the propaganda itself, but the psychological mechanisms underlying it. The Nazis had understood something fundamental about human behavior, something that American intelligence was only beginning to grasp: that people could be made to desire their own subjugation if the subjugation was presented in the right way. Caldwell had spent 15 years working in advertising before the war, crafting campaigns that convinced housewives to buy specific brands of soap, that persuaded fathers to purchase particular models of automobiles. He understood desire, understood how images and words could bypass rational thought and speak directly to the emotional centers of the brain. He had always considered his work harmless, even beneficial, helping people find products they genuinely needed. But reading these German documents, he began to see his entire career in a different light. Every technique he had used to sell soap could be used to sell ideas. Every emotional trigger he had exploited to move products could be exploited to move populations. The only difference was scale and intention. The Nazi propaganda machine was effective, there was no denying that. It had transformed an entire nation, had convinced millions of people to embrace ideas that would have seemed monstrous just a decade earlier. But it was also crude, obvious in its methods. The rallies, the uniforms, the harsh rhetoric, the constant emphasis on strength and dominance and purity. It was effective within Germany, within a population already primed by economic collapse and social upheaval. But Caldwell knew it would never work in America. Americans were different. They were skeptical of authority, suspicious of grand ideological claims, allergic to anything that looked like regimentation or control. The German approach would backfire immediately, would be recognized as foreign propaganda and rejected out of hand. But what if there was another way? What if instead of demanding obedience you made people want to obey? What if instead of forcing conformity you made conformity look like freedom? What if instead of using fear and intimidation, you used joy and desire and the promise of happiness? Caldwell began to sketch out a framework, a theoretical approach to what he called positive effect compliance engineering. The idea was simple: people will accept almost any social or political arrangement if they associate it with positive emotions. Make them smile while you put the handcuffs on, and they won't even notice the weight of the chains. He wrote a memo 23 pages long, outlining his theory. He sent it up the chain of command, expecting it to be filed away and forgotten. Instead, 3 weeks later, he received a phone call instructing him to take a train to New York and attend a meeting at an address in Midtown Manhattan that turned out to be a private club for film industry executives. The meeting changed everything. The men Caldwell met that day represented every major Hollywood studio. They were producers, studio heads, executives who controlled what millions of Americans saw on screens every week. And they were afraid. Not of the war itself, though that was certainly a concern, but of what might come after. They had seen what happened in Europe, how quickly democratic institutions could collapse, how easily populations could be radicalized. They had seen the Nazis use cinema as a weapon, had watched Leni Riefenstahl's films and understood the power of moving images to shape belief. But more than anything, they were afraid of communism. The Soviet Union was an ally now, out of necessity, but these men understood that when the war ended, the real battle would begin. And they knew that America was vulnerable. The Depression had radicalized millions of workers. Labor unions were powerful, sometimes violent. There were socialist and communist parties operating openly in major cities. The wealthy, the powerful, the owners of capital. They were genuinely afraid that America might follow Russia's path, that the masses might decide they no longer wanted to be led by a small elite, might decide to redistribute wealth by force. The war had provided a temporary distraction, a common enemy that united the country. But when the war ended, what then? How do you keep a population docile, compliant, when they have every reason to be angry? Caldwell listened to their concerns and then he presented his idea. You don't tell people what to think, he explained. You don't give them orders or demand their loyalty. You make them feel good about thinking what you want them to think. You associate your desired beliefs with positive emotions, with happiness and laughter and pleasure. You make the alternative seem not evil but joyless, not wrong but boring. You don't fight ideas with counter-arguments, you fight them with better feelings. And cinema, he told them, was the perfect delivery mechanism. People went to movies to escape, to feel emotions they couldn't access in their daily lives. They lowered their psychological defenses, opened themselves to suggestion. They identified with characters on screen, absorbed their values, mimicked their behaviors. If you controlled cinema, you controlled the emotional education of an entire generation. You could teach them what to love, what to fear, what to aspire to, what to reject. And they would never know they were being taught anything at all. The studio executives understood immediately. This was not propaganda in the traditional sense. There would be no newsreels telling people how to vote, no heavy-handed messages about political ideology. Instead, there would be heroes who embodied certain values: rugged individualism, respect for authority, faith in institutions, distrust of collective action. There would be villains who represented the opposite: intellectuals who questioned tradition, workers who organized against their employers, foreigners with strange ideas. And all of it would be wrapped in charm and humor and romance and adventure, so that audiences would absorb the lessons without ever realizing they were being taught. The partnership was formed that day in 1942, though no contracts were signed, no agreements put in writing. The government would provide guidance, suggestions, sometimes direct intervention into scripts and storylines. The studios would cooperate, would ensure that their films reinforced the desired social values. And in return, the studios would receive protection, from investigations into monopolistic practices, from taxation that might cripple their profits, from regulations that might limit their power. It was a bargain that would shape American culture for the next 3 decades. But they needed a test case. They needed to prove the concept, to demonstrate that cinema could indeed be used to reshape public opinion on a mass scale. And they needed to do it quietly, in a way that would leave no fingerprints, no evidence that could later be used against them. That's when someone mentioned Walt Disney. Walter Elias Disney was, by 1942, already one of the most powerful men in American entertainment. His animated films had revolutionized cinema, had proven that drawings could move audiences to tears. His studio employed hundreds of artists, operated like a factory producing dreams. But Disney himself was not universally beloved within his own industry. His workers had gone on strike the previous year, had demanded better pay and working conditions. Disney had taken it personally, had seen the strike not as a labor dispute but as a betrayal, a communist conspiracy to destroy his company. He had developed an almost pathological hatred of labor organizers, of anyone who questioned the natural hierarchy he believed should exist between employers and employees. This made him perfect for what Caldwell and the studio executives had in mind. Disney was already ideologically aligned with their goals, already predisposed to using his art to reinforce conservative values. And his medium, animation, had unique advantages for the kind of psychological conditioning they wanted to attempt. Animated characters could be pure, simplified, archetypal. They could embody values without the complications that came with human actors. They could be designed from the ground up to trigger specific emotional responses. A child watching a Disney film was not just entertained, they were being shaped, their neural pathways literally being formed by the associations they made between images, music, and emotion. The approach to Disney was indirect, conducted through intermediaries who understood how to appeal to his ego and his fears. He was told that his work was vital to the war effort, that his films were needed to maintain morale, to keep America united against its enemies both foreign and domestic. He was given contracts for training films, for propaganda to be shown to troops overseas. And slowly, carefully, he was introduced to the broader vision, that animation could be used not just to win the war but to win the peace that would follow. Disney was receptive more than receptive. He was enthusiastic. He had always seen his work as having moral purpose, had always believed that his films taught children how to be good Americans. Now he was being told that his art was not just entertainment but a weapon, a tool to protect American values from those who would destroy them. He began attending meetings in Washington, receiving briefings on psychological warfare techniques, learning about the latest research in behavioral conditioning, and he began to change how his films were made. Consider Pinocchio, released in 1940 just before Disney's full involvement in the Smile Doctrine. It's a story about a puppet who wants to become a real boy, who must learn to be good before he can achieve his transformation. But what does being good mean in the world of Pinocchio? It means obeying your father figure without question. It means going to school, learning to fit into society, accepting the role you've been assigned. The villains in the film are those who offer false freedom, the fox and cat who promise easy wealth, the coachman who offers Pleasure Island, the carnival barker who exploits Pinocchio's desire for fame. They all represent the same thing, the temptation to step outside your proper place in society. And they all lead to transformation into a literal animal, a loss of humanity. The message is clear, though delivered with such charm and humor and brilliant animation that children never consciously perceive it. Freedom outside the bounds of social conformity leads to dehumanization. True humanity, true happiness, comes from accepting your role and obeying authority. It's a profoundly conservative message, one that reinforces existing power structures and discourages rebellion. And it's delivered to children at the exact age when their fundamental beliefs about the world are being formed. After Disney became fully involved in the Smile Doctrine, this messaging became even more sophisticated. Films like Cinderella, released in 1950, taught girls that their salvation would come not through their own agency but through finding the right man, through being beautiful and patient and obedient until a powerful figure came to rescue them. Peter Pan, released in 1953, portrayed growing up and taking responsibility as the ultimate tragedy, but then showed the consequences of refusing to grow up. Being trapped in eternal childhood, cut off from real human connection, living in a fantasy world. The message, maturity and acceptance of adult responsibilities, however painful, is preferable to the false freedom of perpetual adolescence. But the most effective tool Disney developed for the Smile Doctrine was not any single film, but the very aesthetic of Disney itself. The Disney style became synonymous with innocence, with goodness, with American values. The clean lines, the bright colors, the cheerful music, the happy endings, they created a template for what happiness should look like. And once that template was established in people's minds, anything that deviated from it could be made to seem threatening, foreign, wrong. Sadness became un-American. Complexity became suspicious. Ambiguity became dangerous. The Disney aesthetic taught generations of Americans that life should be simple, that problems should have clear solutions, that good should always triumph and evil should always be punished. It created a population psychologically unprepared for moral ambiguity, for situations without clear heroes and villains, for the actual complexity of political and social reality. This was the genius of the Smile Doctrine. It didn't tell people what to think about specific political issues. It shaped how they thought, the very cognitive framework they used to interpret the world. A population raised on Disney was a population that wanted simple narratives, clear authority figures, happy endings. They were psychologically primed to trust leaders who promised easy solutions, to distrust complexity and nuance, to seek comfort rather than truth. They had been taught, from their earliest childhood, that happiness comes from conformity and that freedom is just another word for chaos. But Disney was just the beginning, just the test case. Once the effectiveness of the approach was proven, it was expanded across the entire entertainment industry. Every studio in Hollywood began incorporating the principles of the Smile Doctrine into their films, though most filmmakers had no idea they were participating in a coordinated psychological operation. The guidance came in subtle ways: a note from a producer suggesting a script change, a conversation with a studio executive about which themes were currently popular, a friendly suggestion from a government liaison about how a particular character might be portrayed. The films of the 1950s reflect this coordinated effort with startling consistency. The heroes are almost always individuals who work within the system, who respect authority, who achieve their goals through proper channels. The villains are those who reject social norms, who question tradition, who want to overturn the established order. And crucially, the films are charming, funny, optimistic. They make conformity look not just safe but desirable. They make rebellion look not just dangerous but miserable. Consider the difference between 1930s gangster films and 1950s crime movies. In the 30s, gangsters were often portrayed with a degree of sympathy, as men driven to crime by social circumstances, by poverty and inequality. The films were dark, morally ambiguous, critical of the systems that created criminals. But by the 50s, crime films had become much simpler. Criminals were evil, motivated by greed and sadism rather than social conditions. Police and FBI agents were heroic, noble, always working within the law. The message shifted from critique of social conditions to celebration of law enforcement. And it all looked so appealing, so clean and bright and optimistic, that audiences absorbed the message without resistance. The same pattern played out in every genre. Westerns became less about the violence and moral ambiguity of frontier life and more about the triumph of civilization over chaos, the importance of strong men imposing order on lawless territories. Science fiction films, which in the 30s had often been about the dangers of unchecked scientific progress, became in the 50s primarily about external threats. Alien invaders, communist infiltrators disguised as monsters, dangers from outside that required unity and obedience to authority to defeat. Romance films taught women that their highest aspiration should be marriage and motherhood, that career ambitions were ultimately unfulfilling, that true happiness came from finding a man and supporting his goals. The smile doctrine was working. Survey data from the period, some of it collected by the same government agencies that had helped develop the program, showed measurable shifts in public attitudes. Support for labor unions declined. Trust in corporations increased. Women who had entered the workforce during the war returned to domestic roles in unprecedented numbers. Political radicalism, both left and right, diminished. The population became more centrist, more moderate, more willing to accept the status quo. And they were happy, or at least they reported being happy. The 50s became known as a golden age, a time of prosperity and optimism, a decade when America seemed to have solved its social problems. But beneath the surface, the costs were mounting. The conformity that looked so appealing in movies created a society that could not tolerate difference, could not handle dissent. Anyone who questioned the consensus, anyone who seemed too different, too intellectual, too unconventional, was viewed with suspicion. The same techniques that had been developed to fight communism were turned inward, used against any group that threatened social stability. And because the programming ran so deep, because it had been absorbed through entertainment rather than imposed through force, people didn't even realize they were being controlled. They thought their beliefs were their own. They thought their values had emerged organically. They had no idea that their entire worldview had been carefully constructed by people who understood exactly how to manipulate human psychology. The man who would finally expose the smile doctrine, or at least attempt to, was not a journalist or a whistleblower or a government investigator. He was a filmmaker named Martin Cahill, and he stumbled onto the operation entirely by accident in 1963 while researching a documentary about the film industry. Cahill had been conducting interviews with retired studio executives, asking them about the golden age of Hollywood, trying to capture their memories before that generation disappeared entirely. And one of those executives, an old man named Samuel Hirsch who had worked as a producer at MGM, had too much to drink one afternoon and told Cahill something he shouldn't have. Hirsch described the meetings in the early 40s, the collaboration with government agencies, the deliberate effort to shape public opinion through entertainment. He talked about the smile doctrine by name, explained its purpose and methods. And he told Cahill where the documentation was kept, the files that proved the operation had existed. Those files were stored in a warehouse in Burbank, maintained by the studios as insurance, as leverage in case the government ever tried to break up their monopoly. Hirsch gave Cahill the address and the name of a security guard who could be bribed. Cahill got access to the files, spent 2 weeks photographing thousands of pages of documents. What he found was more extensive than anything Hirsch had described. The smile doctrine had not ended in the 50s, it had evolved, had expanded beyond cinema into television, into advertising, into music. The files contained correspondence between network executives and government officials, memos detailing how news programs should frame certain stories, lists of entertainers who were considered ideologically reliable and those who needed to be marginalized. There were psychological profiles of the American public, tracking how attitudes had shifted over time in response to specific media campaigns. There were budgets, code names, operational guidelines. It was a complete blueprint for cultural control, documentation of a 20-year operation to engineer consent through entertainment. Cahill began assembling his documentary, building a case that was impossible to deny. But before he could finish the film, before he could release it to the public, he received visitors. Two men in unremarkable suits who showed him identification from an agency he had never heard of. They were polite, even friendly. They explained to him very calmly why his film could never be released. They explained the damage it would do not just to the government or the studios but to the public itself. People's entire understanding of their own lives was based on beliefs that had been carefully cultivated, they told him. If those beliefs were suddenly exposed as artificial, as products of manipulation, it would create a psychological crisis of unprecedented scale. People would lose faith in everything, would be unable to trust any source of information, would be paralyzed by paranoia and doubt. The social order would collapse. And for what? To satisfy his curiosity? To make a point about media manipulation that intellectuals already understood? The operation had already succeeded. The population had been shaped. The damage, if you wanted to call it damage, was already done. Exposing it now would accomplish nothing except chaos. And then they told him something else, something Cahill would remember for the rest of his life. The smile doctrine, they explained, was not an aberration. It was not a secret conspiracy that had subverted democracy. It was democracy, at least the only form of democracy that could function at scale. You cannot have a society of millions of people without some form of population management. You cannot have stability without conformity. You cannot have peace without controlling how people think and feel. The only question is whether that control is exercised through violence or through manipulation, through force or through persuasion. The smile doctrine was the humane option. It gave people the illusion of freedom while maintaining the order necessary for civilization to function. It made them happy while controlling them. What was the alternative? Letting them think whatever they wanted, believe whatever they chose? That led to chaos, to violence, to the collapse of everything. The smile doctrine was not a betrayal of democracy, it was democracy's immune system, the mechanism that prevented the body politic from destroying itself. Cahill gave them the footage. He gave them the photographs. He signed a document promising never to speak about what he had discovered. And he never made another film. He spent the rest of his life working in a bookstore in Portland, Oregon, drinking heavily, telling anyone who would listen that nothing was real, that everything people believed had been planted in their minds by people they would never meet. Most people thought he was crazy. Some suspected he was telling the truth but didn't care. The world he described was so totalizing, so complete in its control, that fighting it seemed pointless. If everything you believed was a product of manipulation, if every thought in your head had been placed there by someone else, then what did freedom even mean? What did resistance mean? You couldn't escape a prison that existed inside your own mind. The files that Cahill photographed were destroyed in a fire at the Burbank warehouse in 1967, a fire that investigators determined was caused by faulty wiring. The photograph from 1942, the one showing the men who had founded the smile doctrine celebrating in the California sun, was lost in that same fire. So were the memos, the correspondence, the psychological profiles, all the evidence that could have proven the operation had existed. Some copies survived, scattered across various archives, but they were incomplete, fragmentary, easy to dismiss as the paranoid fantasies of conspiracy theorists. And in a sense, it didn't matter whether the evidence existed or not. The operation itself had succeeded so completely that exposing it would change nothing. Consider your own beliefs, the values you hold, the things you consider self-evidently true. Can you trace where those beliefs came from? Can you identify the moment you decided to believe them? Or have they always just been there, part of the furniture of your mind, so fundamental that questioning them seems absurd? How much of what you believe is actually yours? How much was placed there, carefully and deliberately, by people who understood exactly how to make you think you had chosen it freely? The smile doctrine understood something fundamental about human psychology that even most psychologists fail to grasp. People do not want freedom, they want the feeling of freedom. They do not want to make their own choices, they want to feel like they are making their own choices. Given actual freedom, actual responsibility for their own lives and beliefs, most people become paralyzed with anxiety. They desperately want someone to tell them what to think, what to value, what to pursue. But they want that guidance to come disguised as their own organic preferences. They want to be controlled, but they want to believe they are free. The smile doctrine gave them exactly that. It created a system of control so sophisticated, so subtle, that the people being controlled would defend it as freedom. It turned citizens into consumers, politics into entertainment, dissent into a product that could be bought and sold. It didn't suppress rebellion, it commercialized it, turned it into a lifestyle choice that reinforced the system rather than threatening it. You could be a rebel by buying the right clothes, listening to the right music, watching the right movies. You could feel like you were fighting the system while actually supporting it. The smile doctrine created a world where resistance itself became another form of obedience. And it worked because it made people happy. That was the genius of it. The propaganda of the past had been grim, had demanded sacrifice and discipline and subordination. It had been obvious, visible, something you could resist if you were brave enough. But the smile doctrine offered pleasure, offered joy, offered the fulfillment of desires you didn't even know you had. It made you love your servitude. It made you smile while the chains were locked around your wrists. And once you loved your chains, once you associated them with happiness and security and comfort, you would fight anyone who tried to remove them. In 1978, 15 years after his documentary was suppressed, Martin Cahill died of liver failure in a VA hospital. He had been a veteran, had served in Korea before becoming a filmmaker, and the VA was the only healthcare he could afford. In his final weeks, morphine-addled and slipping in and out of consciousness, he gave an interview to a young nurse who had heard him rambling about mind control and Hollywood and government conspiracies. She recorded the interview on a small tape recorder, transcribed it later, tried to get it published but found no outlets interested in the paranoid fantasies of a dying alcoholic. The transcript still exists, buried in an archive at a university library, cataloged as an example of Cold War paranoia in popular culture. In it, Cahill describes the smile doctrine in detail, explains how it worked, names names, provides dates. Everything in that transcript can be verified through other sources if you know where to look, if you have the patience to piece together fragmentary evidence scattered across decades. But almost no one has that patience. And those who do, who manage to confirm that the smile doctrine was real, usually reach the same conclusion Cahill did, that knowing changes nothing. Cahill gave them the footage. He gave them the photographs. He signed a document promising never to speak about what he had discovered. And he never made another film. He spent the rest of his life working in a bookstore in Portland, Oregon, drinking heavily, telling anyone who would listen that nothing was real, that everything people believed had been planted in their minds by people they would never meet. Most people thought he was crazy. Some suspected he was telling the truth but didn't care. The world he described was so totalizing, so complete in its control, that fighting it seemed pointless. If everything you believed was a product of manipulation, if every thought in your head had been placed there by someone else, then what did freedom even mean? What did resistance mean? You couldn't escape a prison that existed inside your own mind. The files that Cahill photographed were destroyed in a fire at the Burbank warehouse in 1967, a fire that investigators determined was caused by faulty wiring. The photograph from 1942, the one showing the men who had founded the smile doctrine celebrating in the California sun, was lost in that same fire. So were the memos, the correspondence, the psychological profiles, all the evidence that could have proven the operation had existed. Some copies survived, scattered across various archives, but they were incomplete, fragmentary, easy to dismiss as the paranoid fantasies of conspiracy theorists. And in a sense, it didn't matter whether the evidence existed or not. The operation itself had succeeded so completely that exposing it would change nothing. Consider your own beliefs, the values you hold, the things you consider self-evidently true. Can you trace where those beliefs came from? Can you identify the moment you decided to believe them? Or have they always just been there, part of the furniture of your mind, so fundamental that questioning them seems absurd? How much of what you believe is actually yours? How much was placed there, carefully and deliberately, by people who understood exactly how to make you think you had chosen it freely? The smile doctrine understood something fundamental about human psychology that even most psychologists fail to grasp. People do not want freedom, they want the feeling of freedom. They do not want to make their own choices, they want to feel like they are making their own choices. Given actual freedom, actual responsibility for their own lives and beliefs, most people become paralyzed with anxiety. They desperately want someone to tell them what to think, what to value, what to pursue. But they want that guidance to come disguised as their own organic preferences. They want to be controlled, but they want to believe they are free. The smile doctrine gave them exactly that. It created a system of control so sophisticated, so subtle, that the people being controlled would defend it as freedom. It turned citizens into consumers, politics into entertainment, dissent into a product that could be bought and sold. It didn't suppress rebellion, it commercialized it, turned it into a lifestyle choice that reinforced the system rather than threatening it. You could be a rebel by buying the right clothes, listening to the right music, watching the right movies. You could feel like you were fighting the system while actually supporting it. The Smile Doctrine created a world where resistance itself became another form of obedience. And it worked because it made people happy. That was the genius of it. The propaganda of the past had been grim, had demanded sacrifice and discipline and subordination. It had been obvious, visible, something you could resist if you were brave enough. But the Smile Doctrine offered pleasure, offered joy, offered the fulfillment of desires you didn't even know you had. It made you love your servitude. It made you smile while the chains were locked around your wrists. And once you loved your chains, once you associated them with happiness and security and comfort, you would fight anyone who tried to remove them. In 1978, 15 years after his documentary was suppressed, Martin Cahill died of liver failure in a VA hospital. He had been a veteran, had served in Korea before becoming a filmmaker, and the VA was the only health care he could afford. In his final weeks, morphine-addled and slipping in and out of consciousness, he gave an interview to a young nurse who had heard him rambling about mind control and Hollywood and government conspiracies. She recorded the interview on a small tape recorder, transcribed it later, tried to get it published but found no outlets interested in the paranoid fantasies of a dying alcoholic. The transcript still exists, buried in an archive at a university library, catalogued as an example of Cold War paranoia in popular culture. In it, Cahill describes the Smile Doctrine in detail, explains how it worked, names names, provides dates. Everything in that transcript can be verified through other sources if you know where to look, if you have the patience to piece together fragmentary evidence scattered across decades. But almost no one has that patience. And those who do, who manage to confirm that the Smile Doctrine was real, usually reach the same conclusion Cahill did: that knowing changes nothing. The infrastructure the Smile Doctrine created is still operating, still shaping how people think and feel and believe. It's more sophisticated now, more ubiquitous, more invisible. It doesn't need government coordination anymore, doesn't need secret meetings between studio executives and intelligence agencies. The mechanisms run automatically, perpetuated by people who don't even know they exist. Filmmakers create the stories they were taught to love. Audiences respond to the emotional triggers they were conditioned to respond to. The system maintains itself through the very people it controls, requiring no external force, no visible authority. It has become part of the cultural DNA, invisible and omnipresent and inescapable. There is a phrase Cahill used in that final interview, something he said multiple times, always with the same bitter laugh. Freedom looked beautiful because someone made sure it did. That was the essence of the Smile Doctrine, the mechanism that allowed it to succeed. Freedom, democracy, individualism, all the values Americans held sacred. They had been packaged and marketed and sold like any other product. The packaging was so beautiful, so appealing, that no one thought to examine what was actually inside. They consumed the image of freedom and believed they were consuming freedom itself. They lived in a cage and called it paradise because the bars had been painted to look like clouds. And the most disturbing part, the thing that kept Cahill awake at night even as his body was failing, was that the Smile Doctrine might have been right. Maybe people really did need to be controlled. Maybe democracy really was impossible without manipulation. Maybe freedom was too terrifying, too demanding, too anarchic for human beings to actually handle. Maybe the only way to maintain a stable civilization was to make people believe they were free while ensuring they never actually were. Maybe the Smile Doctrine was not a betrayal but a necessary evolution, the natural endpoint of any society that wanted both democracy and stability. He died without resolving that question. No one has resolved it since. Today, if you mention the Smile Doctrine to a historian, to a film scholar, to anyone who studies propaganda and media manipulation, they will tell you it's a myth. They will explain that while there was certainly cooperation between Hollywood and government during World War II, while studios did make propaganda films and while there were informal relationships between entertainment executives and intelligence agencies, there was no centralized operation to control public opinion through entertainment. They will cite the lack of documentation, the absence of any official records, the implausibility of such a conspiracy remaining secret for so long. They will be correct in every factual claim they make. But they will be wrong in their conclusion. The Smile Doctrine was real, not as a single coordinated operation but as a shared understanding among powerful people about how cultural power could be used to maintain social control. It didn't need a paper trail because everyone involved understood what they were doing and why. It didn't need official authorization because it was simply the logical application of existing power structures to a new medium. And it didn't need to remain secret because even if exposed, even if proven beyond doubt, it wouldn't matter. The control it established was too complete, too deeply embedded in people's psychological architecture, to be removed by mere knowledge. You are living in the world the Smile Doctrine created. Every movie you watch, every song you hear, every advertisement you see is part of a system that was designed generations ago to make you think and feel in specific ways. You believe you are making free choices, selecting entertainment based on your personal preferences. But those preferences were carefully cultivated, the result of decades of psychological conditioning that began before you were born. You are not choosing what to watch, you are enacting choices that were made for you by people who understood exactly how to make you believe those choices were your own. And you are happy with this arrangement, or if not happy then at least comfortable enough not to rebel. Because that's what the Smile Doctrine understood better than any propaganda system that came before it. Control is most effective when it feels like freedom. Obedience is most complete when it's disguised as choice. The best chains are the ones you never feel, the ones that make you smile even as they pull you in the direction someone else has decided you should go. There is no escape from this. There is no moment of awakening where you suddenly see clearly and break free. The conditioning is too deep, too fundamental, too intertwined with your sense of self. You cannot step outside your own mind, cannot observe your own thoughts without using the very cognitive structures that have been programmed into you. You are trapped in a loop of your own consciousness, unable to distinguish between genuine belief and implanted conviction, between authentic desire and manufactured preference. This is the final truth of the Smile Doctrine, the thing that made it more effective than any system of control that came before or has emerged since. It created prisoners who loved their prison, slaves who believed themselves free, a population that would fight to maintain the very structures that controlled them. It turned control into comfort, obedience into pleasure, servitude into a source of pride. It made people happy to be controlled, and in doing so, it made that control invisible, unquestionable, absolute. Freedom looked beautiful because someone made sure it did. And once you learned to love that beautiful image, once you associated it with joy and security and everything good in your life, you would never think to look behind it, would never question whether what you were seeing was real. You would defend that image against anyone who threatened it, would attack anyone who suggested it might be artificial. Because admitting it was artificial would mean admitting that your entire life, everything you believed, every choice you thought you had made freely, was a product of manipulation. And that admission would destroy you. So you smile. You watch the movies, listen to the music, absorb the messages. You believe what you were taught to believe and call it independent thought. You do what you were programmed to do and call it free will. You live in your cage and call it paradise because the bars were painted to look like clouds, and the paint job was so perfect, so beautiful, so seamless, that even now, even knowing what you know, even having heard all of this, you cannot see the bars. You can only see the smile. If you've listened this far, you already understand more than most people ever will. You know that the world you inhabit is not the world you think it is, that the freedom you believe you possess may be the most sophisticated form of control ever devised. Subscribe to War Archives Black if you want to learn more about the wars that are fought in silence, the battles waged inside the human mind, the control exerted through mechanisms so subtle that most people never realize they exist. Like this video, if something in what you heard felt true, felt like a recognition of something you've always sensed but could never articulate. And remember this, the chains you cannot see are the ones you will never remove. The smile you wear may not be your own. Until the next archive, stay awake.